Thank you for everyone that is joining us. We're delighted to have you with us. We are very excited for the next hour. Um, Dr. Kevin McClure of UNC Wilmington and Jorge Burmicky of Howard University will be leading you through, but I just wanted to send uh, well wishes and thanks for joining us on behalf of Javier Ceballos, the president of the American Academic Leadership Institute, and Jay Lemons, the president of Academic Search. My name is Sean Hartman. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer here at Academic Search, and we were really proud to both commission and sponsor this research. Before we get started, be remiss if we didn't thank our association partners, the Council of Independent Colleges, and ask you, our state college and university colleagues, for their support on this 14-month journey. So I am going to turn over the presentation to Kevin and Jorge and let them take it away. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sean. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Jorge Burmicky. I'm an assistant professor of higher education leadership and policy studies at Howard University. And broadly speaking, my research is concerned with equity-driven and socially just leadership in higher education, which is precisely the reason why it brings me here to this webinar. I'm thrilled to spend this afternoon with you all sharing the results that we found from our study on presidential leadership studies, competencies, I'm sorry. And I will turn it over to Kevin for an introduction before we kick off.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin McClure. I am an associate professor of higher education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and co-director of the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. It was an honor to be part of this project. I have been researching higher education leadership, especially at broad access institutions, for many years. Jorge and I have had the opportunity to collaborate on several projects related to the college presidency. This was our first time being able to really tackle this notion of competencies, and we are just really, really excited to be able to share this time and space with you to share a little bit about what we learned. I do want to provide one quick warning, which is that I am in the process of losing my voice. And so I'm going to try to get through this as smoothly as possible. But in the event that I cut out a little bit, my friend Jorge is ready to cover for us. And so with that, we'll go ahead and start by sharing a little bit of the rationale that drove this process. So this idea of what it means to be an effective college or university president remains to be incredibly relevant. Of course, there are concerns about presidential turnover or the amount of time that presidents are in office. Connected to that, of course, is the number of searches that are happening. And those searches are likely asking questions around, what does it look like to be an effective college president? What are the skills and abilities that we ought to be looking for or trying to develop in emerging leaders? It has been some time since prior research on presidential competencies. We are not the first ones to undertake a project like this by any stretch of the imagination, but there has been quite a lot of change over the course of the last 10 years, and even in the last 5 years, there has been monumental shifts in higher education. We walked into this project with the understanding that the college presidency has always been hard. It was hard 10 years ago, it was hard 20 years ago. But the nature of those challenges does in fact change. And so it was important for us to think about, how do we refresh or update our understanding of presidential competencies to reflect how the context has changed? What are the skills and abilities that someone is going to need to really meet the moment? And of course, this is a chance for us to think critically about, how might we need to change or update or reflect on search processes, leadership preparation, and board education, or how we prepare boards to undertake searches as they are looking for an effective college or university president.
We won't bore you with all the details of the methodology, but it is important to share where our data come from. First and foremost, we were able to, we spent a whole year collecting data, first through a survey, and then after we collect the results from the survey, we were able to design protocols for our focus groups. Regarding the survey, as you can see, we were able to get responses from over 700 current presidents who are at bachelor's degree granting institutions. You can see the areas that inform the research instrument, particularly when it comes to leadership qualities or abilities, institutional management skills, knowledge areas to be effective, and knowledge areas that leadership programs should prioritize, which is a very unique aspect of this survey. All of the vast majority of the questions were close-ended, so multiple choice, but we did leave space for open-ended questions just to make sure that we're able to capture some of those thoughts, lingering thoughts that respondents may have that were not necessarily asked during the close-ended questions of the survey. We then looked at that data, and from that data, we were able to design focus group protocols that we utilized for the second phase of our study. So these are, we can talk a lot about the details, with the methodology, but we just broadly wanted to share where the vast majority of how our findings were informed. Related to that, we also wanted to provide a profile of the survey respondents. We don't want to go into the nitty-gritty details of this table right here, but we did want to point out two things. As you can see, our participants, our respondents, consistent with other surveys that have been conducted on the College Presidency, specifically one of the latest results from the ACPS survey, you can see that the College Presidency and our respondents remain overwhelmingly white and male. So that was not a surprise to us, and it is consistent with previous and especially longitudinal surveys that have surveyed the College Presidency. You can see the breakdown here, but because of that, we did want to be intentional on how we recruited our focus group participants. We do want to highlight that something that is very unique about this study is that the vast majority, for those of you who are familiar with the literature on College Presidency, the vast majority of studies of this scale are typically done through surveys. And so is ours. We have a pretty robust response from our survey, but something that is really unique about our study is that we also conducted focus groups. So because of that, we have another level of data that gives us more in-depth, understandings of these competencies, which we were lucky to do by making sure that we recruit participants who are more representative of the students that we serve.
As part of this presentation, we're going to walk through 7 really important competencies that we identified that for us really underlie effective college or university leadership. It's important to note, though, that these are numbered 1 through 7 in our report. For us, it's not necessarily the case that there is one that takes priority over others, but rather we numbered them based on how salient they were or how apparent they were through our data. The other thing that we want to note is that by focusing on these 7 findings, we're not suggesting that these are the only competencies that matter in presidential leadership. We do think that these are really important, but at the same time, we know that there are additional competencies that can come into play. And in fact, in the report, there are a number of additional insights that dig into these competencies, it provide additional examples, but I think also bring in an additional set of skills and abilities. And so although that will be the focus of our presentation today, we do encourage you to take a look at the full report and then reflect on, of course, other types of competencies that we think ought to be brought into this conversation. This is a figure that we pulled from our report, and we're offering this here just as an illustration of that first block of survey questions that we asked to give you a sense of the items that were included as part of that leadership abilities or qualities area in the survey. And we want to also point out that this particular table indicates the percentage of our respondents who felt that that item was very relevant to their leadership. And so in those first 3 items, for example, which were 80% or more of respondents indicating these as very relevant, we see behaving in a way that is trustworthy, consistent, and accountable, demonstrating resilience and an ability to cope with adversity, and communicating effectively and authentically in formal and informal settings. And that kind of offers a foreshadowing of some of the competencies that we're going to unpack as part of this presentation, and helps to illustrate that as we are presenting these competencies, you can see that these are ones that our respondents felt were really, really important for them as they're thinking about their own leadership at colleges and universities. So the first competency that we're going to cover as part of this conversation is trust building. And what was really interesting for us as researchers was the way in which trust came in multiple different ways in the data. Of course, I just talked about how the top survey item, and this is across all survey items, that was rated as very important by respondents, was this idea of behaving in a way that's trustworthy, consistent, and accountable. But in addition to that, we also saw open-ended comments in the survey. And so one of the most common codes in our open-ended survey items was trust building. And so presidents talked in those comments about the need to be curious, to be attentive listeners. There was a lot of conversation in our focus groups about how they create opportunities for multiple stakeholders to come to them and talk with them, and that was a key strategy that they used for building trust. They said focus groups also talked about how important it was, especially with faculty, to provide that reliable channel for them to voice concerns. And one of my favorite quotes throughout this process came from a president who talked about how faculty hate surprises. And as a faculty member, I can understand that sentiment, and I think it's very true. And so for them, trust building was about being able to avoid those moments of surprise, being able to be transparent and bring information forward in a way that allowed people to grapple with it and talk with it so that it wasn't too late for them to be able to engage and provide input. The quote that we offered here as an illustration talks about the need for consistency in how a president is acting, what they're talking about, and what the institution is pursuing. And it's through that type of coherence. A friend of mine, Rob Zinkin, explained this concept to me of coherence that they look for, where we see a lining up of how someone is talking and behaving and what the institution is pursuing that provides trust. Resilience was another top rated item that we saw in the survey. And again, for us as researchers, one of the things that was really interesting to us was how folks were talking about resilience. And we sometimes, I think, have a tendency to think about resilience as an individual having thick skin or having some type of protection that they've individually developed. But what we heard a lot of was presidents talking about resilience through relationships. And so they were able to lean on a network of peers. They were able to lean on their cabinet. Sometimes they were leaning on their family or a faith community. And that was where they were drawing the strength when times really got difficult. The other thing that I think we heard time and time again is that this is a job that is difficult, yes, but there are also ways in which it can be incredibly isolating. And so you might be at an institution that is far away from your family, far away from a place that you've known. I remember interviewing a president who talked about how they can't even go to the grocery store in the town where they're at because they have to stop and have conversations with people. And so you have this weird dynamic of always being with people, constantly around people, but also set apart from them that can make the job really lonely and isolating. And that's where this idea of resilience through relationships is critically important. And we have to think about how we can cultivate this idea of being resilient, being able to cope with adversity through relationships and staying connected with the people that are going to help you in those moments where things get difficult. So it's perhaps not surprising that communication was something that was brought up time and time again. We saw a strong majority of respondents that were thinking about communicating effectively and authentically as being incredibly important. This notion of authenticity got brought up quite a bit in our focus groups, for example. And I think that idea of authenticity can get a little bit fuzzy or slippery. But for us, one of the ways in which focus groups were talking about this was ways in which presidents were able to bring their own voice, their own emotion into communications so that it didn't always feel to campus stakeholders like they were getting an official message or something that had been kind of heavily cleaned up or redacted by somebody else or a different office. They felt as if they were hearing the authentic voice of the president in moments where that was critically important. The skill set here also includes thinking about how do we craft messages for different stakeholders. And it may even be around the same issue, but there are different groups that may need to hear different pieces of data. They may need to hear different types of rationales to help them understand why we are undertaking certain types of activities instead of just what we're doing or how we're doing it. And they talked a lot about this idea of storytelling. And so for many of the presidents, yes, it was important that they had a handle on data. They wanted to be able to share data with campuses, but thinking about how do we bring data to bear on some of these important conversations, but do it in a way that makes sense for that audience. And so they brought up the idea of how important it is for them to be thinking about different team members and different tools that they have at their disposal to be able to craft messages that make sense for these different groups on campus. And thinking about, again, what are those messages that are really important that are coming individually from the president that bear their voice versus messages that could be something that's coming from, the marketing and communications office or somewhere else. So that they have a good understanding themselves of where is it important for me to insert myself in this conversation. So interestingly, in our study of presidential competencies, one of the findings that came through really clearly is that at the same time that we're talking about individual presidential competencies, we're also talking about individuals that are very much nested within a team. And they felt as if they were nodes in a network. And what that meant is the importance or the relevance of a particular competency for them could rise or fall depending on the team that they had put together. Some would say, I don't necessarily need to be on top of this area as much as I once did because I have someone who's outstanding in my cabinet who has taken leadership and I have empowered them to do that. And so we see this really important competency coming up time and time again, and again being reflected across multiple data points of being able to craft a cabinet and lead a team of individuals. So interestingly, a presidential competency is not necessarily about all of these things that a president can do, but what are the things that a president does to empower a team of experts that they have brought in, that they have hired, that they have in some cases developed in order to help them achieve a set of goals collectively. And so this kind of comes back around to the idea of trust, but this was trust from the eyes of our respondents and participants, where they said, it is critically important for me to be able to trust people that I have on my team that I'm asking to take on these critical campus functions so that it's not necessarily all on me. And so in focus groups, we heard a fair amount of conversation amongst the presidents as they were talking about the time and the attentiveness that they gave to crafting a cabinet. And sometimes that meant figuring out how to hire the right person. It might mean thinking about how to relieve conflict or interpersonal dynamics between two cabinet members when they have stepped into a leadership role. And in some cases, it meant saying, I needed to replace someone, and I wish that I had done it sooner and not waited to do that so that I really had the right team in place to be able to move forward with this vision that I've been able to lay out in this position.
Emotional intelligence is our next competency, and this is where, through focus groups, we were able to get a lot more granular about really giving meaning to what emotional intelligence means to presidential leadership. Through the focus groups, we were able to learn that the importance of self-awareness, knowing when to ask for help, and not needing to be the smartest person in the room. This is a finding that is very closely aligned with some of the work that I've been doing for years, particularly as it relates to women and presidents of color. We know, particularly from existing research, that presidents of color and women of color feel the need to or are more willing to ask for help on matters that are critical to their leadership development. We know we know from research that this is something that they're aware or self-aware that is something that is critical to developing, to making sure that, again, you don't need to be the smartest person in the room, and that, you know, if you really want to be effective, you need to have the level of self-awareness, or what in scholarly terms we've talked about, critical consciousness, to really do the work, to really understand what are my surroundings, what are my identities, and what are the areas where it's critical for me to rely on mentors, to me to rely on sponsors, to me to rely on my board, and to simply say, here are the things that we need to do better, and here are the areas in which I need help. So for me, it was really exciting, particularly through the focus group, to really be able to get more granular about what we actually mean with emotional intelligence within the context of the presidency. And we have a lot of wonderful quotes throughout our report that really get a lot more detail about what our presidents meant when asked about this. One of our favorite quotes is the one that you can see on the screen. The leaders who struggle the most, from my perspective, are the ones who have the least emotional intelligence and are simply not able to say, I don't know how to do this. Will you help? Or reach out for help. And this is really critical because, as Kevin highlighted, it kind of spills over how you are able to develop a cabinet that complements who you are, your competencies, but really your understanding of your surrounding context. So emotional intelligence, if this is something that you've been reading about and you're hoping to understand, you know, or get more answers about what does this actually mean within the context of the presidency today, we have a lot of great nuggets in this report that talk about that. Leading with courage. Leading with courage is one that was not as surprising, of course, but we have a lot of interesting quotes on this one that, again, help us operationalize it. One of my favorite stories from when we were doing data collection is that we had a president that was sharing his time when he first started the presidency. And he talked about how long the processes are and how slow we are in the academy to make decisions, and how it was really important for him to gather perspectives from every single stakeholder on campus. And they spend months and months delivering on that decision. And what was really interesting is for him to say, you know, and at the end of the day, I realized that everybody, you know, after all of these months, and I was just complaining about how long it takes to make decisions, I realized that I am now the president. And as a president, I'm the one who actually gets to make that decision. And, you know, for this particular president, he almost forgot that he is now in a position where he gets to be that decision maker. But what did we learn about being that decision maker is that it really does take a certain level of courage that is very unique, because as our president shared, you're always going to make decisions that are going to make many people unhappy. You're going to make, you know, many people happy, of course, as well, but you're going to have to be comfortable to, as the quote highlights here, act in the best interest of others, even if they don't credit you for that. And that's exactly why you do the job. So, you know, in addition, you know, of being a very isolating job, you have to be comfortable with making decisions that a lot of people are going to give you absolutely no credit for. So, you know, it's that part of leading with courage that we were able to get, again, a little bit more specific about what we mean with that. And really, you know, taking action and avoiding the paralysis, quote unquote, which often comes from realizing you are that decision maker now. You know, a lot of our presidents, unsurprisingly, came through the academic ranks. So they're used to, you know, particularly if you're coming from those dean positions, even provost positions, that at the end of the day, you're still the one who's, you know, getting information from various points of campus, but you don't always get to make that final decision when it comes to, you know, to all of the decisions that get to make on campus. And granted that we're very aware that it's, of course, governing boards, which, by the way, we also learned that not all presidents have the same relationship with their governing boards, given that, you know, some are in smaller campuses, other are in larger systems campuses where they might report to their chancellor, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that's different. But at the end of the day, making those decisions that are critical, and understanding that, they're not always going to make, everybody happy, and that you have to be that decision maker, even when people may not give you credit. Last but not least, data acumen and resource management. 80% of our survey respondents said that gathering and using relevant data to evaluate the best course of action was a very relevant leadership skill. Here's the other thing that we think is really important to highlight about this report that we don't often talk about. And that's actually one of our big key takeaways that we will also bring up again at the very end of the presentation. But what we have learned is that you don't necessarily need to be a numbers person to be a data person. You simply have to be able to understand how to leverage your own skills, background, but also leverage a team. I mean, going back to putting together a cabinet that complements your skill sets. So for example, if you are someone who is not as skilled with budgets and spreadsheets, of course, there's a certain level of competency that you have to make sure that you understand those numbers and that you have a firm grip on your university budgets. But just as critical is understanding how to communicate that data in a way that is relevant and transferable to your stakeholders, okay? Because if you're really having critical data, but you don't know how to communicate that, we learned that is actually, just as detrimental as not being good with budgets, spreadsheets, et cetera, et cetera. So the point that Kevin was trying to share earlier about data storytelling is something that we consider to be a critical part of our understanding of data acumen, and just really making sure that you're able to read and understand complex data and budgets and all of that, but just as critically able to communicate it in a way that resonates with your key stakeholders. A final quote here, we had talked to a president, and this is actually very common, where they simply shared, we just waited too long. This is obviously a quote from their previous institution, but waiting for too long to make decisions about hiring the right cabinet that again is going to give you the right team, so that you can do things such as data acumen and resource management in a more effective way. So just don't wait too long. And again, it's not necessarily about being the best at all of those competencies, but really surrounding yourself with a team that is going to complement your strengths and abilities so you can be a more effective president. All right, a few differences or notable differences that that by race and gender. Something that is really critical to highlight about this survey is that, as you can see, the 7 competencies that we just highlighted weren't necessarily aimed at specifically directly talking about DEI. And part of it was intentional. I mean, part of it is this is what our respondents told us, of course. But at the same time, we were very, very intentional about designing a survey where we had questions related to equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout the entire instrument. So because of that intentionality, we were able to see some notable differences on how women and presidents of color respond to certain items. So let me give you a few examples of what that looked like through our results. Women were more likely than men to indicate that demonstrating a commitment to equity-mindedness and weighing the consequences of decisions on different groups were very relevant. And this is because we were able, on those 4 categories that we showed you at the very beginning, we were able to really ask various questions throughout the survey that were able to give us a better idea of how these competencies are perceived differently by various groups when you disaggregate data. The next one that is very interesting is presidents of color were more likely than white presidents to indicate help seeking and recognizing how emotions impact other people as very relevant. Again, this is very consistent with research, certainly my research, on how presidents of color are often more likely to demonstrate help-seeking behaviors. A lot of this, in my opinion, comes from larger systemic barriers that we know that impact disproportionately women and presidents of color in an environment that wasn't always designed for them to succeed. So this is where the help-seeking came really strongly, particularly when we disaggregated data by gender and race. And lastly, presidents of color, as opposed to white presidents and women and males, were more like, presidents and women versus male were more likely to respond that they need a mastery of specific knowledge areas to be effective at their institution. There's a lot to unpack here, but just to give you an example, we knew that a lot of presidents, particularly those presidents that came from perhaps more under-resourced institutions, may have to get a greater mastery of things like, for instance, accreditation, things where institutions tend to be more at risk. And as a result of being in those types of institutions, they have to develop competencies that, you know, their counterparts may not have to necessarily leverage. And this is often because of, you know, how stratified higher education is, particularly when it comes to the institutions where presidents of color are leading. So it was really interesting to see that, you know, there's different types of knowledge areas where presidents of color may think that is more important for them to develop. All right, a few takeaways before we open it up for Q&A. So final takeaways. First and foremost, and this might be frustrating to some, is that what we've learned is that there's truly not a checklist for presidential leadership competencies today. Part of it has to do with the fact that we all have different pathways and trajectories that led us to the presidency. We all have different knowledge areas and trainings. So the reality is that, you know, there are certain competencies that you may be better, more well-versed than I am. And as a result, if you treat it as a checklist, you might be working on competencies that are not necessarily as pertinent or relevant, not only to you as an individual, but your context. So both who you are, your training, your experiences, and your context, particular institutional context, is really critical to understanding which competencies you should be working on. So that's why we don't necessarily give you a checklist. Here's what you need to be an effective or competent president. We give you a list of again, items that were ranked as very important or rated as very important, as well as, you know, some of the information that we got in the focus groups, but it's not necessarily a do these and you will be an effective president. Public perception influenced the salience of certain competencies. I think that we're all very aware about how the presidency has been shaped by public perception. I think in the past few months, we have seen how critical it is to have a handle on public perception and how that impacts not only your decision-making, but how you're perceived about being an effective president. So again, this is when it really, that critical consciousness and just really understanding your stakeholders, but also the environment in which you're leading is really critical to, again, understanding which competencies to develop. As we shared earlier, emotional intelligence was a key ingredient in trust building and resilience. To build trust, people have to see that you're being transparent, that you are also communicating in a very human way. That's something that we learned we have very, very interesting stories about, the presidents that will say, I don't understand why people are complaining about my communication when I'm sending my weekly emails and my monthly newsletter. I'm sharing with my stakeholder what's going on. The reality is that you have to be self-aware and emotional intelligent to understand, emails and newsletters may not cut it anymore. Particularly with students and faculty. So you have to really understand, you have to be self-aware of what are the forms of communication and what are the ways to engage? Are we talking about in-person town halls? Are we talking about virtual gatherings? Are we talking about all of the above? Probably. But really just having that self-awareness that allows you to know, this is how I build trust. This is how I'm also more resilient. And this is how I really reach all of my stakeholders. Cabinets can be your biggest asset or your biggest challenge. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I can take from this study is that don't wait too long to make those courageous decisions to hire the cabinets that are gonna make you best. Those are hard decisions, but the more you wait, what we've learned from our data is that it does get worse, you know, and you want to make sure that you leverage your cabinet to have the most effective presidency, and just simply not let, you know, institutional history necessarily, you know, hold you back from making decisions that are only going to make your presidency more successful. And last but not least, data acumen is more than just numbers. Again, the power of data storytelling and making sure that you're communicating complex data and information in a way that is consumable, that is relevant, and that is, you know, ultimately available to your various stakeholders, and making sure that you're not just having great data that you can just keep to yourself and your cabinet and your board, but just really communicate with your stakeholders in a way that is effective and relevant to who they are. That is all of the information that we have for today. Of course, we encourage you to check out the report because there's so much information. It's obviously available on the website. And at this point, I want to take it, give it to Sean so he can field some of the questions and give some final thoughts.
Thanks. Thanks to you both. A great presentation and really appreciate it. If you have any questions, we have a few minutes here that we can spend. If you have some questions, go ahead and put those in the question and answer box, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. On the Academic Search website and our social medias, we'll post follow-ups of videos, of slides, of handouts for those of you that may want them. So I guess for the two of you, one of the questions we have is, having completed this research, what areas would have liked to delve into for greater detail or understanding?
Well, I'll share very quickly. You know, and I think we did. I think I appreciate that question because one of a big surprise from this study is that we were really able to capture the humanity of what it means to be a college president. And honestly, it's actually made me want to do more research in this area, going back to your question, because I think that we've read a lot of reports that talk about how lonely and isolating the presidency can be. But in this report, we were able to get more granular about what that means. And I think that I'm really grateful for the focus groups with that. And again, part of, you know, having your community, your village, the people that are going to support you so you can become more resilient. But I think that, you know, if I were to do this again, I would want to dive a little bit deeper into that human side of the presidency, because I think it's really interesting. And I think that it surprised me to a point where, like, yes, we know that, you know, a lot of presidents are feeling lonely and isolated, but this is what they do to overcome that and be more resilient. Kevin, I don't know if you want to share something about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, there are so many different areas that we could explore as a follow-up to this. I'm constantly thinking about, you know, Sean was a thought partner with us throughout this process. And for him, he was constantly asking us, you know, how do we do this? How do we develop these competencies? And I think we just scratched the surface of that particular question. There's still, I think, a lot of work to be done around how do we take these skills and abilities and then think, what does really effective leadership development look like in light of this? How we know that someone has developed these skills. And so I would love to see us think as a next stage about that question of how, and even what does it look like to turn this into a type of thoughtful and generous self-assessment, to help us understand, if I'm someone who's thinking about stepping into a leadership role, where am I at? And where are some areas that I could improve upon in order to better prepare for what I'm going to see?
And part of it for us is, it's not just a roadmap for preparation, but it's also for preparation for while they're in the seat, but supporting the entire life cycle, which also means once they've attained the position, how do we support them and how do we offer renewal as well? So that it's just not a finite point, that it's back to that, it's not a checklist. You don't accomplish these and move on, but as the context of your institution and your leadership evolves, how are we retooling? How are we rethinking? And that kind of leads me, Kevin, Jorge, into our next question. What are the main points you want hiring committees or governing boards to understand?
Well, I'll quickly say that, we often want our leaders to be superheroes. We often want the perfect leader to come to our institution and turn things around and essentially say, yeah, this is who we needed. This is, who's gonna essentially fix all of our problems. But the reality is that that's just not gonna work. And so a question that I think that is really critical is that, yes, when we come up with these ideas of like, this is the candidate that we want, institutions, search committees, and everybody else, governing boards, they ought to ask themselves the question, are we also ready? Is our institution ready for this type of leader? Because otherwise, we're only going to set them up for failure. I often see this being the case, particularly with women of color, presence of color, where they come in and they're the first ones in the institution to be XYZ. But the reality is that if the institution is not ready to support that kind of leadership to enact change, but also just provide support, because crisis will happen. It's not if crisis happens, but when crisis happens, how is the institution ready to support that leader?
Yeah, this makes me think a little bit of another question that I read, and so I may be skipping just a little bit, but someone asked a really good question around, given some of these competencies, do we need to be thinking differently about like the early part of a search process, which maybe relies heavily on a candidate's CV or the positions they've held, their pedigree versus some of these skills that may be harder to get at. And a piece of this for me is that I think there's a responsibility on the part of boards to be thinking about how do we assess some of these competencies in our performance review processes? Are we only emphasizing, you know, the numbers, construction projects, growth, or are we also thinking about ways in which some of these competencies can be translated into other types of metrics and ways of evaluating performance? And then similarly, if we're thinking about how we're building position profiles, the types of things we're asking candidates to speak to in the materials that they submit, not just asking them about what they have accomplished, but also who are they and how have they gone about the work? What does it look like for them to manage a team? There's another project that Jorge and I did where we were interviewing some search consultants, and it reminds me of one talking about how we have to be asking questions that get at their behaviors, that get at kind of the way that they're going to approach problems, how they are going to act when conflict arises. And I think that there's a similar exercise that could be done where we take these competencies and we say, what are the types of questions that we need to ask on the front end that will help us get at the extent to which someone has emotional intelligence or has the type of resilience that comes from strong skills in relationship building?
I agree, Kevin. I think for the searches that we lead, searches that are led for presidencies, really do need to focus on the how you got to the accomplishment, just not the accomplishment. And so, did you secure the $50 million, build the new building? It's not just the accomplishment in and of itself, but it's how did we get there? What did the president demonstrate in order to get to that point, so that we're going beyond just who can speak a good game, or sometimes who not just rewarding the best game show host, but rewarding those with the skills. And here we're providing the competencies. So what did trust building look like? How did taking on a challenge with courage look? So going beyond the surface to look at those other pieces. When we think a little bit about preparation for the presidency, one of our questions, what changes or adaptations would you suggest for leadership development programs based on these findings?
Yeah, as we shared in our methodology, we were very intentional about having a section that was just to ask about how we can do better with presidential leadership or leadership institutes in general. And I think my biggest takeaway for this is that not all presidents are the same and not all presidents have the same needs. So I think a lot of these preparation institutes or any leadership development models really need to be thinking more critically about what are the specific needs of leaders, emerging leaders, when you look at their various identities, but also the types of institutions that they lead, because we know that not all institutions are the same. We in higher education, we have the tendency to treat certain groups as completely homogenous. So just to give you an example, oh, HBCU presidents do X, Y, Z. Well, HBCUs are very, very diverse. There's smaller private HBCU, there's public research intensive HBCUs, there's, private research intensive HBCUs, et cetera, et cetera. There's land grants and all of that. So really just, I think we need to stop being so one size fits all model in leadership development institutes and really think about, okay, who are you as an individual? What is your preparation? What pathway did you take to get here? But also, what are the sectors that you aspire to lead? And what is your understanding of those sectors, especially in an era where we have so much legislation and so many changes that are impacting sometimes the sectors that we're most passionate about? Things like anti-DEI legislation. How are you going to deal with something like that? How about AI? All the different things. There's so much changing. So really understanding who you are, again, I think we've talked a lot about that, but also the context and the types of legislation and climate that is affecting the landscape as a whole.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because I would like to do some research on leadership development programs because I think there's a need for that. Here's the thing. I think it's entirely possible that we've got really, really good leadership development programs. They're already speaking to dimensions of this. The challenge is, to what extent are those one-off programs where maybe for the most part, the real value add afterwards is the network that you build as opposed to like the content or the skill development. The way that I might flip this around is, for me, doing this project leaves me wondering about how, instead of thinking about our leadership development programs doing this, instead having individuals who are aspiring to presidencies or in presidencies asking themselves, what am I doing to constantly update my own skills? Am I having critical conversations with myself about whether or not I'm still learning the things that I ought to be learning? And the reality is that simply by arriving and having reached the presidency, you have a set of competencies, sure, but the context is going to change. Next year it's going to look entirely different, and we're going to be needing to push ourselves to keep updating those skills and not assume that we have checked any of them off at any point. And so, yes, there's probably a place for leadership development programs to be thinking about, okay, maybe we could be shifting our curricula in certain ways or, emphasizing a piece of this that we haven't thought about. But there's also that piece of us that are in leadership, that are thinking about leadership, trying to reflect on how we continue growing in these areas. And it's probably going to take more than a program to get there.
I think with our own leadership development programs through ALI, one of the things we've been trying to work with, particularly Javier and Tara, is really focused on the both and. So it's not just the knowledge of athletics, but it's how do you apply these competencies when at the athletics event, there's racial slurs used by either your campus or a visiting campus. Because the issue isn't just about athletics, that it becomes this intersectionality of all of the competencies built into how can you respond, and equipping people. I feel like long time ago when I started, it very much was kind of the 50-minute presentation on athletics. Here's what you need to know. Here's what you need to keep in mind. And the literature and the programs have evolved into a both and. Yes, you need to know, there's a foundational amount of knowledge you need to know, but there also has to be a piece of this, which is what's the application? And what's the application in this social media intensive environment where it literally could be happening in real time? Some of our presidents say, before I used to have a day or two to gather my thoughts, to work through this, to work with the team, to bring everybody in. And that doesn't happen when it's literally happening, being streamed live. And so how do you respond in that moment? And without these competencies, there's not a basis to act from then. If there's not trust, if there's not good, if there's not communication savvy, if there's not leading with courage. So how do we respond? And I think that's where a lot of, particularly our ALI programs are going, is kind of this both and. So Kevin, Jorge, I'll turn it over to you for any kind of closing thoughts and to wrap us up.
Kevin, you want to go first? I was ready for more questions, but go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I just want to first of all thank everyone who's been part of this conversation. I think we recognize that there are a lot of people that are very committed to this idea of presidential leadership. They're committed to thinking about how do we help folks that want to step into this really important role. How do we reform the role itself to make it more sustainable? How do we educate search committees and help boards to be able to not just select good people, but support them in these positions? And so I think for Jorge and I, a piece of this, as he noted, was to help remind us that these are people that step into these positions. And some of the ones that for us came through as showing these competencies really clearly were really effective relationship building people managers. And it doesn't necessarily sidestep or downplay the importance of some of those more technical skills, but it does suggest to us that there are maybe some skills that we haven't emphasized enough up until this point, and that it's entirely possible that by doing so in our leadership programs and in our searches and in how we evaluate effectiveness, that we arrive at a profile of leader that is a much better fit for our institutions, that are outstanding leaders. They're good people, good at relationship maintenance. And so I think it's a call for all of us to reflect on to what extent we can set the conditions for those types of leaders to be able to come forward and again to be able to stay in the job. And so for me, this is just a small piece of that, right? This is one study in an ecosystem where there are a lot of people involved. But we're grateful to have been part of it, and looking forward to this hopefully being a continuing conversation and one that can be productive and helpful to us in the long run. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will briefly say, yes, of course, this study was about presidents, but I really do believe that this document is for anybody who sees themselves as a leader in higher education. I really think that something that we need to do better as an institution is really just better supporting the needs of our emerging leaders, of the various leaders throughout, because all of us are having a change at our institutions, not just presidents, and we know that. And I often see, as I was reading many of the questions here, I see so many people getting discouraged about, I once thought, I have a lot of students that share this with me. When I came into this program, I said, I'm going to be a college president. And it's very sad to me that as they study the presidency, as they study higher education as a whole, as they live and practice higher education, they say, you know what, this is not for me. And I think that's a problem for higher education to tackle, to address. And I really think that this document gives you a lot of information for governing boards, search committees, everybody, really, everybody, to look at how can we become more ready for the types of leaders that we want, for the types of leaders that our students deserve, and I really feel like there's a lot of work here. This document, you can just use it in so many different ways. And there's so much data that we have that we didn't even get to analyze, by the way, because, you can only do so much with so much data. And we had about a year to do all of this, So if you're wondering, I wonder how differences are, when you disaggregate by the institution, that data is there, but we didn't even get to analyze it all. So there's so much more. So we're just really hoping that this is just the beginning of something really wonderful. And again, I really hope that even if you're not thinking about being a president, this document is also for you, because everybody needs to be encouraged, so we can continue to do the good work that brought us here to higher education.
I just want to say just a closing thank you to Kevin and Jorge. It has been, seems like a long time ago when we started these conversations over what do you think if we did something, and to have it a release is really exciting. I would be remiss again, even though our study looked across sectors and did have responses from presidents from all sectors. We did work closely with particularly the research and leadership development teams at ASCU and CIC. And so I just want to again say thank you to both associations and their teams for the wonderful work. It is our hope to make this into a longitudinal study, that we can begin to trace this, maybe even expand it to other positions as well, but really begin to keep track of what we emphasize in so many of our programs, which is those that want to be a president versus those that want to do the presidency, and giving a kind of a roadmap for those that want to do the presidency. What does it take to do that? And so thank you all for joining us. It has been a pleasure and really appreciate you being with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.